this position and to acknowledge that all of the peoples who are indigenous peoples in this world have human rights as well. The government of New Zealand acknowledges human rights for citizens that are white, but continues and for 22 years has asserted that indigenous peoples, 370 million in the world, are not really human beings and that we are not entitled to the protections of international human rights law. The Indigenous Pacific Caucus is here once again to demand that the racist government of Helen Clark and the New Zealand Parliament take action to enforce the human rights of the Maori peoples. We will never relinquish our claims to land. The Declaration is a framework for peace.
And it is time that New Zealand accept that we must all live in peace and through peaceful coexistence together. Thank you
very much. My name is Andrew Erueti, and I am Maori of Ngāti Ruahine in New Zealand. And I've been working in the area of Maori rights and human rights for 12 years as a lawyer and now as a professor in New Zealand. We call upon New Zealand to take a leadership role in promoting the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. For us, we think this is a sad, unfortunate case of New Zealand showing its manifest self-interest and seeking to keep a cap on the aspirations of Maori people in New Zealand. We think that is unfortunate because New Zealand doesn't show its concern for Indigenous peoples in other developing countries who rely upon these norms and principles in the Declaration to a great extent. They're vulnerable peoples, and New Zealand should be showing more of a leadership role here instead of being one of the leading groups, one of the leading nations that is resisting the draft declaration. So we ask New Zealand to change its stance, and it has a reputation generally as being a nation that upholds human rights, and we think they should put their money where their mouth is. Thank you very much, and tēnā koutou katoa.
International Forum on Globalization, on behalf of the Emergency NGO Coalition in support of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We are honored to be here in New York City today in front of the New Zealand mission with so many of our non-governmental colleagues who have joined us here to form the Emergency Coalition in support of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Dozens of NGOs from around the world, from the human rights, development, environment, Indigenous rights communities have joined together here and now to express our complete support for our Indigenous colleagues and friends and communities in their long struggle to achieve global recognition for the rights of Indigenous peoples. And yet, we're also saddened and outraged at our reasons for being here. This coalition has come together in only a few weeks to address what we consider to be an appalling situation of human rights hypocrisy. The efforts of the governments of Canada and New Zealand, whose embassy we're standing in front of right now, and Australia, all developed nations with long histories of activity at the UN, and for Canada and New Zealand in particular, with well-known records in support of human rights. With this in mind, we are stunned by the efforts of particularly New Zealand to derail and weaken one of the most important human rights documents to come before the United Nations since its founding in 1945. That's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. After 22 years of negotiations and acceptance just last year in the newly formed United Nations Human Rights Council, this declaration deserves the support of all nations in the UN, but especially those who claim to be promoters of global human rights. New Zealand claims to be such a promoter, then why is it undermining this declaration? 22 years of negotiations is a long time, but it's nothing compared to the centuries of discrimination, abuse, treaty violation, and displacement and cultural and physical genocide that's been perpetrated by against the thousands of communities and nations of Indigenous peoples around the globe. It's well past time that the 370 million Indigenous people in 5,000 communities and nations that still exist today receive their basic human rights protections. that will help them preserve their societies, their governments, their languages, cultures, lands that they have inhibited since the beginning of time. We are not so naive to think the fact that so many indigenous peoples' territories are in areas that contain rich natural prime targets for mining, logging, and other extractive industries has nothing to do with the reluctance of some governments and some nations that have traditionally supported human rights on all fronts. We are calling on these nations and today on the governments of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia to join the global NGO community, indeed the majority of the global governmental community, in support of this declaration that is long overdue. It will never repair the unacceptable damage that has already been done to the Earth's first peoples. However, it will at the very least, and most importantly, afford them the rights for future protections that will ensure that their essential governments, ways of life, and relationship to the Earth will endure on and into future generations. And this statement is signed by the following the International Forum on Globalization, the Advocates for Coalition of Development in Uganda, Africa International Foundation from Kenya, Amazon Alliance, Amazon Watch, Arid Lands Institute of Kenya, Center for International Environmental Law, Cultural Survival, Earth Rights International, Flying Eagle Women Fund, For Freedoms Foundation, Friends of the Earth, Global Exchange, Hawaii Institute for Human Rights, Plutonium Free Future,
the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment from Uganda, the Africa International Foundation from Kenya, Ghana, and East Africa, the Amazon Alliance, Amazon Watch in the United States, the Arid Lands Institute of Kenya, the Center for International Environmental Law, Cultural Survival, Earth Rights International, the Flying Eagle Women Fund, the For Freedoms Foundation, Friends of the Earth in the U.S., Global Exchange, the Hawaii Institute for Human Rights, Menotti Plutonium Free Future from U.S. and Japan, the Indigenous Environmental Network from the U.S., International Funders of Indigenous Peoples, the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Rivers Network, the Missionary Oblates for Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation, Oceania Human Rights, Oil Change International, Oxfam America, Oxfam Australia, Rainforest Action Network, the Rigoberto Menchú Fund, Sierra Club, the Solidarity Foundation, Survival International, the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, the Trans-Africa Forum, and the United Nations Association of the East Bay Chapter in California, and many, many other organizations who